the Institute, and the Office of Sustainability, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Connecticut webinar for the Solve Climate by 2030 initiative. The global pandemic and associated telecommuting and social distancing directives have represented significant challenges to planning and executing this webinar. In advance, we apologize for any technical difficulties that we encounter along the way. Nonetheless, we're quite happy to have found out that over 400 registrants representing about 850 individuals have indicated their intent to participate in today's presentations. Indeed, we think we've arrived at an appropriate mechanism for communicating and discussing solutions at the local to regional scale that will enable us to make significant progress to meeting carbon emission reduction goals that are responsible and responsive to social justice and equity issues as well. The Connecticut webinar is organized into 4 parts. We will begin with a welcoming statement by Dr. Eben Goodstein, who has been a catalyst for this international effort. That will be followed by presentations by each of 3 distinguished speakers who will present their ideas and thoughts about solving climate by 2030. After the last presentation, we have reserved some time for the panelists to react to each other's commentary, and we will conclude with a question and answer session during which all attendees can submit questions via the chat feature in WebEx. Nonetheless, it's important during these presentations that everyone except the presenter make sure that they've disabled audio and video and not otherwise interfered with the production facilities that we're using today. Next slide, please. Before linking to Dr. Goodstein's remarks, I wanted to acknowledge the dedication, hard work, and flexibility of the steering committee and the intern support staff who have made this webinar and associated sustainability events possible. I sincerely appreciate all that they have done over the past few months, and especially over the past few weeks as we transitioned to a virtual world and making this webinar possible. 2020. The title of her presentation is Changing Conservation Conversations, the Future of Environmental Leadership. Wawa will be speaking to us while we view her PowerPoint presentation. Wawa.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, everything is fine. Thank you, Wawa.
I'm just going to put a timer for myself so I don't go over. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Gatheru. Call me Wawa, and I am a senior here at the University of Connecticut, which is kind of virtual right now. I'd like to thank the steering committee for selecting me to do this presentation and this talk. I think it can add a really interesting and pertinent point to the general conversation on solving climate change and ensuring that our movement is up to par with the issues that we need to solve and at the speed we need to do that. So as the presenter just said, my presentation is called Changing Conservation Conversations, the Future of Environmental Leadership. And the entirety, oh, I'm breaking up. Can you hear me now more clearly? Okay. I had my headphones in just to make sure that none of my family makes any noise. But I'll just jump into it. Okay, so my presentation is called my presentation is called Changing Conservation Conversations, the Future of Environmental Leadership. And this talk is really going to be centering the fact that our environmental space, our climate space, I use those terms interchangeably, are at this really crucial turning point in which we need to really work to diversify our field to ensure that our movement looks, feels, and talks like all of us. So next slide. I will jump right into Would it be all right if we went to the next slide? Thank you. Hopefully, since we're all tuned in here, we understand that climate change is happening, it's real, and we need to act now. And it is actually our biggest existential threat. It isn't our first existential threat. People have had to fight for their lives before. Tomorrow hasn't always been promised, but it is our biggest existential threat, and we need to act now. And we know this for a variety of different reasons. We can go to the next slide. We know this across the aisle. We know this in this past decade. This past decade was the hottest decade ever recorded, actually, with 2019 being the second hottest year and 2018 being the hottest year. We even know this from the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry knew that climate change was being driven by human activity in the 1970s. And for those of us that are immersed in this space, we're constantly reading reports that seem to be coming out on a daily basis that are really looking and exposing the scale and scope of this problem, and showing us that we need to act now. We also know this because we're experiencing it right now. Oftentimes we think about climate change as this futuristic phenomenon, in a cold, jargon-filled concept, but in reality, it's happening right now. So if we go to the next slide. um, Climate change by a variety of different names, right? Through the experiences of the folks that have had to deal with things like Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Florence, Imelda, Irene, Dorian, Katrina, Sandy, and the fact that these natural disasters are happening at a more rapid pace with climate change. We also know from these natural disasters and climate change in general, like many other social issues, climate change doesn't impact us equally, right? Climate change impacts all of us. It's a very inclusive issue, but the way that its impacts are distributed is not equal. So if we go to the next slide. Climate change presents unique social, economic, and humanitarian challenges. In fact, race, geography, age, gender, socioeconomic status, and language, and other identities triangulate its impact. So, the proliferation of climate change has a disproportionate impact on communities of color and low income communities in the United States and around the world. Within the American context, right, racial and ethnic groups face sort of double jeopardy from the climate crisis and being the most vulnerable to heat waves while already being more likely to live near toxic facilities um, and also having limited access to health insurance or medical services. That said, right now we're at this really crucial turning point. If we go to the next slide. We have the data, we have the storytelling, we have people experiencing this right now. And so we have the time to actually curb the worst of these impacts. We're here today because we're trying to solve climate change and really begin to be on this path for a just transition by 2030. The world's top climate scientists have told us that we have a 10-year window to make rapid reductions in carbon pollution, and if we don't, we could severely destabilize the global climate, leading to extreme weather, droughts, floods, and sea level rise that will impact us all, but again, disproportionately impact some of us more than others. And we've been given the opportunity to act to really address the inequities that exist and also just ensure that we aren't dealing with what could potentially happen from inaction. So right now, in this turning point, more than ever, we're having Americans understand that action needs to be taken right now to address climate change. In fact, regardless of what sometimes we think that climate change just seems like more of an indecisive issue. A lot of surveying is showing that more Americans consider it to be a serious problem, including more than a quarter who say it's a crisis. We're also dealing with another turning point in terms of our demographics as a country, as a nation. People of color, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, and mixed race individuals are going to become the majority in the United States by 2042. So all these culminations of all these demographic and climate changes provides us with a turning point that is also a challenge, but an opportunity. In order to solve climate change, the environmental slash climate movement must work to create a movement made in the image of all of us. And that starts with diversifying what and who we include within our space, right? So, how equipped are we in regard to this plight? Well, if we go to the next slide, we can see some of those numbers. So we have a lack of diversity. We have a diversity crisis within the environmental climate space. The organization Green 2.0 released the most comprehensive report on diversity in the environmental movement. It surveyed 191 environmental nonprofits, 74 government environmental agencies, and 28 leading environmental grant-making foundations to investigate their gender and racial diversity composition, and the numbers were quite bleak. The report talks about this phenomenon known as the green ceiling, which is this phenomenon that says that despite increasing racial diversity in the United States, despite the fact that people of color are 36% of the US population, the racial composition in environmental organizations and agencies has not broken the 12% to 16% green ceiling that has been placed for decades. Why is this a problem? Well, diversity is important for a variety of reasons. I mean, we can look to nature to see how diversity is so important. But specifically in talking about the environmental and climate space, I'm going to bring up three main reasons, right? One, we have a moral responsibility. We have a moral responsibility to achieve a unified democratic movement that creates solutions that include all of our voices, which will then in turn create solutions that help support all of us. It's also a wise choice. As I said before, it's projected that by 2042, the majority of the people in the United States will be people of color. As people of color continue to grow and communities of color continue to grow in our influence and in society and where funds are located, a mass appeal and relevance will be even more important in terms of having a movement that really takes all of us into account. Lastly, more on a level that a lot of us can talk about, I mean, in regards to our organizations and our organizing spaces, it creates more effective spaces. Diversity allows us to have more creative approaches, it enhances innovation and problem solving, and it brings a broader base of knowledge and skill sets to bring to the table to bring solutions that are more expansive. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to be briefly talking about why it is that we have the problem that we have, and then later on, some of the tangible solutions that we can walk away with, how we can make the changes we need to make on a local level, even on a larger level. This slide is just more of that report. I won't go over everything, that'll take up too much time, but I can also provide everyone with, or if you're interested in diving into that more. So next slide. This is just a quote that one of my mentors. But next slide, please. Okay, so again, why? I'm going to break it up into three main points, right? History, framing, and culture. And for discussing history, I'm going to open it up with a quote that I often look to by one of my favorite authors, James Baldwin. And James Baldwin once said, "History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. And it does not refer principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in everything we do." So, with that in mind, it's important to understand how our environmental climate movement challenges with diversity is not merely a reflection of institutional racism in the broader society, but actually a product of the movement's own exclusive beginnings. The environmental movement sprang from the conservation movement, which came about in the second half of the 19th century, where early conservationists viewed nature as an antidote to the ills of civilization, right? As an escape from the cities, and as an escape from air pollution, crowding, and other problems that people were finding in the city. But much of this agenda and much of the way that this has impacted how the environmental slash climate movement is today came at the great expense of communities of people of color and indigenous folks, right? For instance, the establishment of reservations stripped indigenous people of their ancestral lands and restricted their access and use of them. Many of the early leaders, say Madison Grant, were known eugenicists and white supremacists, and many of the early leaders dispossessed land promised newly emancipated Black citizens after the Civil War, and many Native American tribes to make room for new parks and monuments. So, from the early beginning of the environmental conservation climate, I use all these things interchangeably. There's been a past that has helped create a legacy of a disconnect, right? Next one is framing. Despite the fact that people of color are the most affected by climate change and environmental degradation, there is this persistent belief within the community and outside of the community that we don't care about the issue. And a lot of this is due to a lot of reasons, right? There's traditional indicators of environmental concerns, such as environmental group membership, visits to natural areas, and monetary contributions to environmental organizations. Those haven't necessarily been the things that you find a lot of people of color involved in. So that has led to this persistent belief that if we aren't involved in these very conventional, traditional ways of expressing or being an environmentalist, we simply aren't interested, which isn't true. So is there something? Is sound going wrong? I can see the audio. Okay.
Audio is great.
Getting cutting in and out. Let me see. Hello.
We can hear you fine, Wawa. This is Mike.
Okay, I'm getting some people messaging saying that they haven't heard anything. Should I just continue?
I think we can hear. There may be some that can't, but I've heard. I mean, you're the audio link has been garbled at times, but I could hear you throughout.
Okay. I'll just try to wrap it up. I'll just go to the next play. Culture, environmental organizations often hire new employees by referrals and from the same networks, which often replicates existing culture and hiring decisions, which perpetuates the green ceiling that we're talking about before. Um, so in terms of solutions and the recommendations that hopefully we can talk about more in the question and answer and the discussion, I brought up four, though this conversation could probably go on for days. The first one is cultural change in the movement itself, and that can happen within the academic sphere, within the work sphere, or within our organizing spaces, right? And the first thought that a lot of people have um, in regards to culture change is recruitment. Recruitment's really important, especially from a hiring perspective, especially at the executive level and the board level, um, especially in regards to having a diverse job interview panel. However, call in my phone. Sorry, I'm like reading the messages that people are giving me on how to sound more. But alas, um, cultural change moving beyond recruitment. It entails being culturally competent and at understanding different ways of communicating with people. A multicultural organization acknowledges that remaining diverse and managing various viewpoints will be an ongoing challenge and provides regular discussion, open forums, and learning to create opportunities that help resolve organizational diversity issues for long term, right? The next is partnerships and collaborations, working inside the movement, but also outside the movement. Working inside the movement allows us to move forward and grow exponentially in regards to collaborating with each other to understand how different people, different parts of the movement are working to support our diversity efforts and building upon each other. Outside of the movement, that means working across movements, right? That includes seeing the similarities between the labor, civil rights, faith movements, and understanding that those movements are absolutely viable places to find folks that are most likely just as invested within environmental issues, but may not have historically aligned themselves with calling themselves an environmentalist organization or person. Expanding your list of partners allows us to better understand and different movements and also ensure relevance amongst folks. Engaging young people of color, I think Connecticut is doing a really good job in terms of having mandatory education, but also going beyond that, right? Going beyond that and looking within mandatory environmental curriculum and ensuring that we're prioritizing um, various points of what the environment is, right? Expanding the traditional conceptions of the environment to include the importance of neighborhoods, workplaces, and cities. The last one is connecting the generations, right? As I said before, climate change is our biggest existential threat, but it's not our first one. Tomorrow hasn't always been promised. And communities of color know a thing or two about building movements, about courage and survival. And we can learn from the successes and failures of, say, the civil rights movement and other social movements of our time and before our time. And that can be a place for us to really learn the language of resilience, hope, and survival, and really integrate that within the climate movement. And yes, that's the end of my presentation. I apologize for the connection issues. Hopefully, it'll work later on.
Well, thank you very much, Wawa. Obviously, in this current COVID-19 situation, we're all limited by the Ethernet's ability to effectively link us one to the other. And 4 o'clock is obviously a time of very high demand on the system. And we're only as strong as our weakest links in terms of our audio and video connections. So I think that certainly plays a role. And again, as for the organizers, we apologize for any challenges that the listeners have had in hearing this. We will work to try to get clearly audible and viewable representations of all today's talks available to you after this meeting, as well as hopefully during the meeting. But at this point, we will move on to our next speaker. And it's my pleasure to introduce our third panelist, who's speaking in the second place. That's Mackey Dykes. He's the Vice President of the Connecticut Green Bank. The title of Mackey's presentation is Solar Energy, an Affordable Solution Today for a Carbon Neutral Future. Mackey will be speaking to us while we view his PowerPoint presentation.
Great, thanks, Mike. This is, as Mike just said, this is Mackey Dykes with the Connecticut Green Bank. Before I jump in, let me just make sure. Mike, am I coming through okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, coming through loud and clear. Thank you.
Great. All right. And it looks like my first slide is up, so I'll jump in. So first off, thanks to UConn for the invitation to be here today. It's an honor to be on such an esteemed panel, and I'm only sorry that we all couldn't be together for this event. But it is great to see such a large turnout and large interest for a virtual event. So I think as everyone knows, and I wish we could have gotten Leticia's presentation first. It looked like she was gonna really get into some of the numbers around this, but the carbon emissions associated with power production are a major contributor to global climate change. And renewable, non-carbon emitting energy production is going to be a key factor in moving to the zero carbon world that we have to get here, or that we have to get to. So today I'm going to talk about one of those key renewable energy sources, solar power, and the various pieces that come together to make a solar project happen. And over the last 10 years, several changes in all these pieces have led to an acceleration in the deployment of solar, an acceleration that is good to see, an acceleration that we need, but one that is going to have to continue to accelerate exponentially to get to where we need to be. But thanks to the progress that has been made, as the title of the presentation alludes to, solar is now an affordable solution for more and more people to play a role in reducing the reliance on brown power. Next slide, please. So real quick, let me just give a quick overview of my organization, the Connecticut Green Bank. We are a quasi-public agency here in the state of Connecticut that is focused on confronting climate change by using the tools of financing to accelerate the flow of private capital into the markets that energize the green energy economy. So, really we use primarily the tools of public-private partnerships to bring affordable capital in to clean energy projects. Oftentimes, the upfront cost is one of the biggest barriers to making a project happen. So, by making sure affordable financing is available, we seek to make more and more projects happen that wouldn't otherwise. The next slide. And let's go one more. So solar is an affordable and growing solution. And let's, I alluded to when I began about the acceleration in the deployment of solar. So what this slide does is it takes a look at that acceleration from a U.S. National perspective. As you can see, starting in 2010, the growth rate and the deployment of solar just really taken off. And what this slide encompasses is really all solar. So this would include panels on someone's home. This would include non-residential, so panels on a business or a church. And it also includes utility solar. So that is, when you're driving, a lot of it in Massachusetts, but you see some of it around here in Connecticut, those large solar fields, those large-scale solar projects. That's what the light blue bar represents. Today, I'm going to be talking about the dark blue and the yellow bars, what we call behind-the-meter solar, the solar that's focused on meeting the electrical demand of a single building, and how we as citizens in our everyday lives and the buildings that we go through and throughout our day, how we can get solar on those and play a role in reducing the reliance on fossil fuels. So next slide. Great. So I'm going to bring the lens down a little bit, focus on again the areas I mentioned, the solar on buildings, and also bring the lens down to our state to look at how solar has grown over the years. I do want to point out one important thing here. The non-residential, really, it takes a while for the data to flow and for those systems to become operational. So the 2018 and 2019 bars do not reflect the non-residential solar that we expect to come online. This represents when the incentives for it were approved, and those commercial projects take a while to get built and to bring online. So, in a year or two, if I were given this talk, those green bars would be a lot bigger for those years. So don't think that there's a massive decline in commercial solar going on in Connecticut. So next slide. So why is this happening? I mean, as you've seen at the national and state level, there's been a large growth in solar. And I believe that there's three factors that have led to this. One is the cost, two, policies and incentives, and three, financing. So I'm going to go through these different reasons, the different pieces that are behind a solar project and how they come together to lead to this deployment. So let's go to the next slide. Let's start with cost. Next slide, please. So again, let's look at the national level. There has been a massive decrease in the cost to install a solar system. Over the last decade, dropped by more than 70%, which is represented by the yellow line on this graph. And you see the corresponding increase, the blue bars in the deployment. And this chart represents both utility scale and behind the meter, so solar on buildings. It's a lot cheaper to build those large utility scale projects just because of the efficiency, the economies of scale you get. So the $1.50 a watt that you see the yellow line at, we don't see those prices in Connecticut for a system that you might put on your home, but we still have seen a large drop. And speaking of that, actually, let's move to the next slide to look at, to bring the lens down to Connecticut again. The Connecticut Green Bank oversees the residential solar incentive program for the state of Connecticut. So we have great data on residential solar cost and installations in the state. So this chart, going back to 2004, shows you in Connecticut how we've seen those prices drop. So, what would have cost you as a homeowner back in 2004 wanting to do solar around $60,000. Now it's just a typical sort of average size solar system in Connecticut now is around $25,000, and that's before incentives. So, this massive drop in cost that we've seen at the national level has also happened in Connecticut. Next slide. So cost, that's great. $25,000 though is still a lot of money. One of the other factors that has played a role in deploying solar and helping reduce that upfront area of cost are various state and federal policies. Next slide. And the primary ones that play a role in a solar project in Connecticut today are net metering, which is a state of Connecticut policy, ZREC, if it's a commercial system, which stands for Zero Emission Renewable Energy Credit, or for residential projects, RSIP, which is the Residential Solar Investment Program. That's the incentive program I referenced earlier that the Connecticut Green Bank oversees. And then finally, the federal tax benefits that accrue to the owner of a solar system, and that's obviously at the federal level. So let's unpack each one of these. Next slide, please. So net metering is the first policy that plays a big role. So as you can imagine, when you think about when the sun's shining, which is when a solar PV system is producing the most electricity, that doesn't always line up with when a building is using electricity. During the day, you got a solar system on your home. Usually you're out at school, you're out at work during the day. The power consumption is pretty low, but that's when your system is producing the most power. So what net metering does is allows the building to get credited for solar power that it doesn't use when it's produced. Probably the easiest way to think of this is essentially if the system's producing and the building energy demand is not there, the meter is rolling backwards. So that if the demand is there and you can use the power, that's great. Your meter isn't rolling forward and you're not buying power from the utility. But if you're not there, again, it doesn't literally happen, but it's the best way to think about it. Your meter's going backwards, so that when you come home at night, you flip everything on, you start pulling down from those credits that you got before. You're rolling your meter forward, but you're using that solar power that you quote unquote banked. So that overall, over the course of a year, which is how this net metering plays out, you're aligning your total building demand with the total amount of power that the system produces. Next slide, please. So the other state policy that helps reduce the cost for these systems, first on the commercial side, is the ZREC program. And again, that's Zero Emission Renewable Energy Credit, or REC is what a renewable energy credit, or what REC stands for Renewable Energy Credit, which what that is essentially it's a tradable environmental commodity. So, the state has decided for policy reasons to, because we want to incentivize green power, to place a value on a megawatt hour of clean energy that a megawatt hour of brown energy wouldn't have. So what a REC is really, it's like a certificate. It's a tradable commodity so you can monetize that the clean attribute of that megawatt hour that your clean energy generation or generator produced. So that's what a REC is. What a ZREC is the utility through this program that was started about 8 years ago will sign a 15-year contract to purchase those RECs at a fixed price. So it's a revenue stream that a commercial system owner can count on. The modeling has gotten very good with a solar system. We know pretty accurately what it's going to produce every year. So, you can bank on that much power being produced, and then the utility is going to purchase all the RECs that are associated with that power. So it's a very bankable revenue stream that you can use when you're thinking about the economics of the system. Next slide. And then on the residential side, you have the RSIP program. That's much more straightforward. The Green Bank oversees this, and we give you an upfront grant to reduce the cost of the system. So, the $25,000 solar system that you're going to buy to put on your roof, we give you a rebate. So, you're spending much less to purchase that system. Next slide. And then the final policy that plays a big role in making a project happen and reducing the cost is the federal investment tax credit. It's currently 26% for whoever owns the system. So what that means is, let's say you buy a $100,000 solar PV system, you get a 26% of the value of that, so $26,000. $26,000 is a dollar for dollar reduction in your federal income taxes. So, it's essentially a $26,000 grant that you realize through paying less taxes. So this is this is an incredibly large incentive that plays a big role in making the economics of a system come together. Next slide. And finally, financing, the third factor that has led to the growth in solar. So again, let's go back to the other two. There's been a large reduction in the cost of the system, but still a lot of money left, even with that reduced cost. We've got incentives that help reduce that cost, but still, you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars to get a solar system on a roof, or even more for a business. And again, that's just not something that many are able to afford. So new financing mechanisms have played a large role in overcoming that remaining financial barrier. Next slide. So I'm going to touch on a few of these. The first and the most common in Connecticut at the residential level is what's called a power purchase agreement. And the way this works is you have a third party that owns the system. They pay all the upfront cost to have it installed. So as a homeowner, you don't have to, all of that, say $20,000 cost is borne by the third party. And you as the homeowner sign an agreement to buy the power from that system. And the rate that you buy the power is cheaper than you would have bought that same power from the utility. So for instance, let's say the cost of electricity from your utility is 15 cents a kilowatt hour. You would sign a power purchase agreement with a solar company for 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So for every kilowatt hour that the solar system produces, you're paying 10 cents instead of 15 cents, so you're saving 5 cents for every kilowatt hour you can get from that system. So this allows anyone to for no cost up front to install a solar system on their roof and to immediately start realizing savings on their bill from that system. And this is also very common in the commercial space as well, especially for nonprofits and churches who they don't pay federal taxes, so they can't access that incentive. A power purchase agreement is a way for them to go solar. Next slide. I think I'm running a little long here, so I won't cover all the benefits of a PPA. But again, primarily it's that there's no upfront cost, and you're able to start realizing savings from day one. Next slide. And then you also have several new long-term debt programs. CPACE, Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy, is one example. This is financing that's available on the commercial side. And then you have similar products on the residential side that allow someone to get a loan at a very long term at a fixed interest rate. And when you can offer financing at those terms, what you're able to do is cover 100% of the upfront costs. So again, you're taking a loan out, you're covering all the upfront costs, and then your repayments on that loan are lower than what your energy savings are. So it's similar to the value proposition is similar to a power purchase agreement. There's no money out of pocket, and you're able to save more than you pay for your financing. Next slide. So this brings us back full circle to where we started on the growth of solar. So let's look at it through the lens of these three factors. When you combine all these, the cost reduction that we've seen in solar, the incentives which help reduce that cost even more, and then the financing, you can create a value proposition that frankly is attractive to someone that doesn't even care about the environmental benefits of solar. And I don't mean to be crass, but I think that in order for us to really realize the goal that we're going to get to, it's going to involve making solar something that makes sense from an economic perspective as well as an environmental perspective. And what we have today is really that scenario where I speak to businesses all the time about installing solar, and when I go through all this with them, they frankly think I'm hoodwinking them. That the fact that you can, for really no money out of pocket, start saving money on your energy bill just seems too good to be true. So it's creating that scenario where it's almost too good to be true, and where do I sign is what has led to this growth. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to the moderators.
Thank you, Mackey, for your presentation. I think the message came through loud and clear, And at this point, I think we're able to recoup our losses in terms of our inability to move forward with the video and return to Leticia Colon de Mejias. Again, she's the founder and chief executive officer of Energy Efficiency Solutions. The title of her presentation is Efficiency is Efficient, an Equitable Path to a 100% Clean Energy Economy. Leticia will be speaking to us now directly while her PowerPoint presentation is moving forward, but we will be certain to send the link to her formal video when we send out an acknowledgement email at the either at the end of today or early tomorrow. So with this, I'd like to welcome Leticia to the webinar and ask her to speak with us.
Hi, can you hear me?
The volume is low. But clear.
A little better?
About the same. I think people can hear you pretty well. I think we'll just have to pay closer attention, but it's coming through very clear, albeit low.
Okay. So hi, my name is Leticia Colon de Mejias. Bear with me as I just go through these slides with you. So I wasn't please just have some compassion. All right, so energy efficiency is efficient. It's the equitable path forward to 100% clean energy.
You're fading in and out, Leticia. We can't hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Very clearly.
Awesome. So next slide. Thanks. So many of us are focused on climate talk, carbon talk, clean energy, green energy, EV policy, infrastructure, build-outs, wind, solar, geothermal, transportation. And the point is that all of these things are just a simple way of saying we have a problem that is large, long-standing, and needs to be addressed. But to address a problem, you need a plan. So what steps do we need to take to lay the foundation for our success? Because without a plan, a goal is just a wish. Next slide. Climate change is real. Pollution is harmful and waste is bad. So whether or not you think humans are the cause of climate change is really irrelevant to the conversation moving forward. The common goal is reducing energy waste, lowering energy costs, and creating a stable, sustainable energy future. We all agree pollution is bad, and likely we think that wasting money on a resource is not the best approach for the people or the economy. We agree that creating local jobs and enhancing economic growth and lowering pollution and closing affordability gaps are a positive way and are good choices. Conservation is the conservative approach to being efficient with our resources, and efficiency results in doing more with less. Next slide. Today, we use more energy than ever in the history of mankind. From morning till night, while we sleep, we're constantly demanding energy. This is ever increasing, and as a society, we have never been this connected or dependent on electronics for our daily needs, especially during COVID. Welcome to Webinar 101. We have never had to make changes more rapidly than we ever have had to make them before. Next slide. We use more energy and we use it everywhere. I am beating this as a point because it is something that we must think about. Whenever we're using energy, it is being generated somewhere, and in most cases, it's in a fossil fuel plant. On the left, you're going to see the phantom draw stealing 10% of our energy, and a little resource that you can take a look at later on where we're using energy. Next slide. Where does this energy come from? Well, unless you work in energy like me, it's very unlikely that you're thinking about where your electricity comes from or what's heating your home. Very little has changed in the world of electric generation, but we sure do keep on making new ways to use energy and spend very little time thinking about where it comes from or how that is impacting us as a people or a planet. Next slide. So your energy is coming from the same place it did when Einstein invented it. We're still using magnets, a turbine, and water. We heat that water generally by using a fossil fuel source or nuclear, which includes the use of uranium, which is also mined like a fossil fuel. It's very important that we consider where our energy is coming from as we plan a path forward equitably to mitigate climate change. Next slide. So 95% of Connecticut's electricity is non-renewable, and 5% is renewable. This is the numbers from 2017, folks. Nuclear power is generating about 48%, and natural gas about 47. Sometimes those numbers flip-flop around, but natural gas has also been expanded for heating as well as electric generation. And so we have unfortunately experienced some capacity problems in New England due to that large expansion of natural gas. Next slide. World carbon emissions by demand. So we want to take a little step back and look at a larger scale. So when we look at carbon emissions on a worldwide level, energy generation is still 25% of that pie. Buildings come in at almost 8%, or around 34% of all energy carbon emissions are related to buildings and electricity generation. Next slide. Global consumption of electricity has accelerated in 2018. In fact, that number was declining steadily because of our increased focus on demand reduction and efficiency in buildings. And so we had been lowering that problem, but in 2017, that problem kind of shot through the roof and started expanding, not just in the United States, but all around the world. 72% of that expansion in our global consumption was from nations that are building out their infrastructure and joining us on the level that we are in the United States. In the United States, most of this increase in our generation demands was from residential area, to the consumption of appliances and our increased use of air conditioning, which is related actually to climate change. Next slide. So what's demanding the energy? Humans, it's us. You know, we're doing this with our smartphones, our TVs, our cooking, our washing, our showering, our cooling needs, which are increasing everywhere in the United States. Buildings and the energy we demand in them represent collectively one of the largest sources of carbon emissions. But like air, we don't often think about electricity or heat until they're not available to us. So I want to just point to you this little pie chart at the bottom, which shows transportation in Connecticut. And this is the GC3 report at 35%, electric generation in buildings coming in at 50.52%. And then the graph on the top is the same graph, just in a bar graph versus in a pie. Next slide. So local carbon emissions, here you go. I've broken it down for you just so that everyone could think about that the energy electric power bar at 22.6% is going to use in buildings, which are residential, industrial, and commercial buildings. And I've broken those down for you in this graph, showing you that 31% of carbon emissions in Connecticut is just from buildings alone. And then when you add in the 22%, you're pushing you up there in your 50s. Next slide. So why is this important? It's important because most of the energy we're demanding is unfortunately from non-renewable resources. Next slide. And consumption by use. I'm just going to skip this, but I just want you to understand that less energy waste is less carbon emissions, and less energy waste closes the gap to allow us to ramp up to that 100% clean energy through clean energy resources. Next slide. So what does this mean to us? Well, both buildings and transportation use energy and emit harmful pollution and carbon. Electric generation results in carbon emissions at the site of production and through combustion processes. And we also have losses in the transmission. And then there's that whole problem of digging up that fossil fuel from the ground, making a mess of the world. Many buildings and homes are old and inefficient, and it's time to address the root cause of the issue in the waste of energy and resources and the pollution. Next slide. So here's what we can do. Goals need plans. And in order to work and implement specific steps to reach those goals, we have to create policies and laws which are directed by our leaders, governors, and legislators. These are voted into law, and they guide our plans and direct the funding, collection, and distribution of resources. These are all important to weigh in on. It is a benefit to all of us that these plans work together to meet both the energy and carbon goals. And we should be really focusing on diversifying the parties, writing and implementing these plans so that we ensure an equity lens and start with options that help the most people first. Next slide. Equity in planning, or lack of it, is something that we have to really focus on. There is a clear need to continue to view issues through this lens because energy is connected to everything. It impacts our quality of life, our ability to work, be warm, have access to information, use phone, etc. Some people have problems related to energy affordability, and housing and health outcomes can be impacted by our collective energy choices. The energy affordability gap, for example, in Connecticut, includes over 400,000 households that can't afford to keep their heat and lights on. And this is going to continue to impact our choices as we build out. Next slide. Increasing energy savings lowers carbon emissions. This is because by reducing the waste in buildings such as homes, multifamily buildings, commercial, industrial, small businesses, schools, buildings that we live, work, and play in, we're lowering the waste in those buildings and lowering our energy cost and the air pollution at the same time by focusing on air sealing, insulation, window upgrades, improved HVAC controls, and thermal boundary heat loss issues. Next slide. Climate change impacts our needs for heating and cooling demands. So as we have hotter summers, we have to expand our cooling needs, and thermal boundary upgrades lower the demand for both heating in peak season and cooling in the summer. So we're helping ourselves by increasing the thermal boundaries in buildings. Next slide. There's an answer we can afford, and it's expanding energy efficiency. It's cost effective, it's carbon effective, it increases positive health outcomes, it lowers water waste, and it closes the affordability gap. Next slide. I'm just going to skip this one because we can look at it later, and I'm running short on time, folks. Why expand EE? Because efficiency, like your mother, has been working without you even noticing it. It's like your mom who gets up in the morning, packs your lunch, gets the groceries, makes your dinner, washes the sheets when you're not in bed. It's the economic, energy, and health impact saving programs that are well documented as efficiency resources and benefit all of us. Next slide. What are the benefits? Well, in Connecticut, 1 year of energy efficiency increased our gross state product by $1.4 billion, had a net tax benefit of $140 million, lifetime saving outcomes of $962 million, created 34,000 local jobs, and increased our positive health outcomes by $814 million through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Next slide. And if that didn't wow you enough, 10 years of energy efficiency makes us want to jump for joy. So efficiency doesn't just make dollars, it makes sense. It has provided residential and business customers with a decreased energy burden of $3.7 billion in savings, is the equivalent of removing 11.4 million tons of emissions from cars off the road, or 2.4 million cars off the road, and has decreased our need for more than 2 power plants in New England by lowering our megawatt use by 265,000 megawatts. Next slide. Saving energy saves lives, and it improves them. Hartford, for example, with a 15% energy reduction, could reduce health impacts by $73 per person. It would save 6 lives a day and avoid $20 billion in health harms and lower 30,000 asthma attacks. Next slide will show you how. How does efficiency save and improve lives? Well, air sealing creates warmer, drier air, improved temperatures and relative humidity, lowers heat and cold-related death, decreases hypertension and heart disease, and reduces asthma attacks and chronic pulmonary diseases by reducing indoor air problems and reducing outdoor air problems by lowering air pollution. Heating system upgrades also reduce moisture, particle pollutants, and combustions and allergens, lowers cancer to lowered radon and formaldehyde, and creates a less stress and better mental health by lowering bills and increasing comfort. Next slide. Clean energy policy is like making rice and beans. When you're making energy policy, you have to think about how to make the energy sources that you're using go farther. And just like serving rice and beans, where beans are your protein, efficiency is the rice that you place your beans on. Because no matter what type of beans you're using, nuclear, gas, coal, solar, wind, hydroelectric, you always want to use less of that resource so that it costs less and is more effective. So putting rice underneath it or lowering our demand through efficiency allows that plate of beans to go farther. Go on. Next slide, please. We're going to skip this. You guys can read on later. Skip it again. How do we do it? Again, We're going to use building science principles to draw down our demands, and you guys can review that process later at efficiencyforall.org. Next slide, so we don't run out of time for questions. Next slide. Here's an example. Loomis Chaffee School, they drew down their energy consumption by 32% by using the Energize Connecticut program and installing deeper upgrades, no pun intended there, on 19 properties, and they saved $21,000 annually. And this school actually included high school students in the process to allow them to learn how to draw down consumption and ramp up renewables at the same time. These folks went off with 1 megawatt of solar and ductless mini split electric heating and are now becoming an off-grid school. Next slide. Same thing, this works in residential. Next slide. Multifamily savings as well. You can implement the exact same type of processes through building science. Next slide. Goals require plans, and cambio is the word for change in Spanish. Daily actions influence our outcomes, so behavioral choices are important to our survival and success. We must continue to share and motivate people to make changes and give them the information to make the best choices. We must increase equity and inclusion in our planning processes. No problem is too big, because together we can actually make a change. Next slide. And we'll have questions at the end. Thank you so much for bearing with me, folks. I apologize for the rapid PowerPoint, and I hope to post my video up later so that you can see this in a slower and, I don't know, more effective process. Thank you for including me.
Thank you, Leticia. Your presentation went quite well. And at this point, I want to, in fact, thank all three of the panelists, Leticia, Wawa, and Mackey, for their thoughtful, informed, and inspiring presentations, for taking the time from their busy schedules to craft and deliver these talks to us, and for participating in our subsequent discussion. I'm sure that if this meeting were in physical space rather than virtual space, we would all be hearing a resounding round of applause and appreciation for your messages. Moreover, I want to remind everyone at this point, not the panelists, but all the other attendees, that if you have any questions, please submit them via the question and answer feature in WebEx. But before going directly to the question and answers, we wanted to give the panelists an opportunity to make any brief comments or to engage each other in a discussion now that they've heard each other's presentation. So at this point, we will unmute the panelists' microphones and allow them to chat with each other, respond to each other's commentary before we move on to the question and answer session.
This is Mackey Dykes. I just want to say I completely agree with everything Leticia talked about with energy efficiency. It's often called the first fuel because it's the easiest way to, it's a lot easier than building a new generation source. Just reducing the amount of energy that we use is often the easiest and the cheapest route to go. So, we should always make sure, before looking at a solar installation, that you first right-size your building demand to, so that you're not producing more green energy than you need, spending more money on a larger solar system than you need. So yeah, we've set up our residential incentive program to make sure that anyone before they get a solar incentive gets an audit of their home to make sure that they're reducing their energy use before they think about putting solar on. So it's definitely the best way to reduce our carbon emissions from electric production.
Any other comments from the panel before we move on to the questions and answers?
Can y'all hear me?
Yes, clearly.
So I just want to say that I really, really enjoyed Wawa's presentation, even though I couldn't hear everything she was saying. I think it's really important to look at the the whole picture overall. People often get confused and they think like focusing on electrification is super important, for example, but what's important is taking a step back and looking at what's causing the problem and then looking at ways to solve those solutions one thing at a time in a strategic process instead of just throwing everything at different things, kind of focusing ourselves in at the solutions that are going to fix the largest problems first and then reallocating the resources to new things while we ramp up our renewable resources, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think that's clear. And I think it's really, what's really clear from all three presentations so far is that, we're at a turning point. It's very urgent that we address this issue, and that in order to be successful in doing so, we need to make sure that we expand the range of perspectives, experiences, and solutions that we bring to the table. We want to empower creative and innovative solutions by fully engaging the full capacity of society. And to do so in a non-diverse and non-inclusive manner is to stack the decks against us as we move forward. So I think that you're both are absolutely right in that regard. Any other comments or questions for the panelists would like to address to each other? Hearing none, I will move on to the final section of today's webinar. That's the question and answer session. And for this section, Patrick Mackey, the Sustainability Program Manager in the Office of Sustainability at UConn, will be posing questions to the panelists based on the feedback that we've had via the chat feed or via the question and answer feature in WebEx. So with this, I introduce Patrick, ask him to take over the microphone, and while at the same time ask the panelists to stay on board with your microphones unmuted so that you can answer any questions that he directs to you individually or to the panel as a group. Patrick.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for staying with us for the duration of this event. We have a few questions from the audience that I wanted to address with all of our panelists today. The first one is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic helped decrease climate emissions, and has it helped us in our goal of solving climate by 2030?
Hi, Leticia here. And people are at home and they're using a lot of energy. They're logging on to webinars, they're working from home, kids are at home on the computer, watching TV, playing video games. So we actually are demanding a lot more energy during COVID. The only thing that has reduced is like flying and driving. And our climate change problem is a long-term, long-standing issue that is not going to be solved in a few months of COVID. We have to actually make a plan and then implement it strategically. That's my response.
Yeah, this is Mackey. I started to see some reports coming out of China, and as they start to restart their economy, seeing some of the impacts of the shutdown that similar to what we're going through now, and it seems maybe there is perhaps a short-term reduction in carbon emissions thanks to a lot of the manufacturing that paused, and certainly because of the decreased transportation. There's just not as many cars on the road. You don't have the shipping. You don't have the planes. So reduction in carbon emissions there, and certainly I know I've already seen studies on the air quality improvement. But that's all, as what Leticia said, I agree. It's all short term. Everyone's praying and doing whatever they can to make sure that we have a V-shaped recovery and everything goes right back to where it was before, which, I think that is what we want. But I think it can be a learning opportunity when we look at the impact that the shutdown had on the emissions. Certainly not suggesting that we implement measures that we've had to take now, but it could be just a good lens to view the impact that all these various things that we do on a daily basis without thinking about has on the world from the carbon and air perspective. So yeah, I think maybe some short-term benefits, maybe a long-term benefit in terms of making people pay attention to this a little more, but I think long-term it also could hurt in the sense that we're going to most likely have some tough economic times to come, and the focus on clean energy might not be as it was before, when times were great, but we're certainly better than they're most likely going to be for a little while.
Yeah, just to echo the points that the other panelists have made, I think it's going to be more short-term decreases in emissions. I've been seeing some reports saying that there's been seeing decreases in emissions, but specifically in the second part of the question, where I believe you asked on your essential goals of solving climate by 2030 and how COVID-19 could impact that. For me, COVID-19 is kind of revealing to me that a lot of what we've been told about incremental change and the slow bureaucratic process of changing our systems and ensuring that our policies are just, we're finding out that we have the ability to it quickly. We have the ability to see a problem, see its urgencies, and completely restructure our society in a way to address this issue. And what I'm learning is that, and what I think we could all learn from this moment is that a lot of the media hype, a lot of the way that we are learning about COVID-19 and taking it seriously, that same type of urgency also needs to be given to the climate space. You need to be thinking about flattening the curve for climate change in terms of emissions. And I think there's so much to learn at this point, and there's so much to learn in regards to building partnerships with folks. I've been kind of trying to figure out personally, how do I talk about climate change? Because it's always on my mind, right? How am I going to talk about climate change and get people to listen when right now COVID-19 is happening? It's in everyone's face. And after a while, and all these days that I've spent alone in my room, I've begun to understand that this is an opportunity to really build empathy in a way that I've often feared that climate change would show us when it was too late. Right now, everyone's being impacted by COVID-19. It's not the same way with climate change, where some people are experiencing it so obviously, so up in their face, while others aren't. COVID-19 is really bringing us together in this unfortunately inclusive way, and this allows us really to see this is reality that climate change and not addressing climate change could bring about. So if we see that happening right now and relate to each other and empathize with that, that could potentially be a framework to continue to empathize with people that are experiencing climate change first and worst, but also as we continue to experience it together.
Okay, thank you. I think this question would be best suited for Leticia, but if anybody else would like to chime in, feel free. I've heard in my classes that when we increase energy efficiency, humans just tend to use more of it. Are there any ideas about how to prevent this sort of conundrum?
Yes, there are. Basically, the longstanding issue with climate change is that there has been no major effort to educate the general public on ways to save energy or energy choices, or how our choices are impacting the environment or the humans that live on planet Earth. We can help get people emotionally connected to the problem and to the solutions. This way we could all win. Ultimately, if people understand where their energy comes from and how their choices of using energy or wasting energy are impacting us, I do believe they'll make a change. Because to be honest, I worked in healthcare for 16 years. And when I learned that my energy choices were impacting the planet, the people, and would hurt my children in the future, I made the choice my first choice was to go solar, because I didn't know about efficiency. I'd never heard of it. And solar seemed like a very attractive option to lower my carbon emissions. I immediately went solar, and through that process, I learned about energy efficiency, and then left my day job to become a full-time energy expert so that I can help lower carbon emissions and change the world and better the planet for my children's future. And I think other people would do the same if they understood the problem.
Great. This question is for Mackey. Should someone interested in installing solar on their roof wait until prices continue to drop?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I don't know that we're going to see the same level of drop in prices that we have seen. Most of the reduction has been, well, let me step back. We split the categories of cost for solar into what we call hard and soft costs. The hard costs are the actual equipment itself, and the soft is everything else, the sort of intangible, the labor, the marketing, the capital, permitting, things like that. Most of the reduction has been on the hard side, as the efficiency and just the production methods have gotten so much better. I don't know how much more. I'm not an engineer, I'm not an expert on that field, but there's only so much you can squeeze out on that side. There's a lot of effort now on the soft side to reduce those costs. But they're always there's always going to be there. Customer acquisition, filing permits with the town. You're always going to have to do that as part of the project. So, I think waiting for some future possible cost reduction is just going to yield, or you're going to miss the lost opportunity of dollars in your hand now, dollars saved, which a dollar now is worth more dollar than in the future. So I think thanks to a lot of the upfront cost barriers being removed, and the fact that you can immediately start to realize savings, lead to the conclusion that it makes sense in the world we live in now, with where all the various factors I went through to go solar now. And also, not to mention, as those costs, if they do come down more, the incentive structures are timed to pull back. So I mean, the residential slide that I showed, you saw the level of incentive reducing as the cost came down. So in reality, the cost to install a residential system hasn't changed that much in Connecticut from the actual homeowner's perspective, because the subsidy was so high to begin with. But as costs have come down, we've reduced the subsidy. So it's really the ratepayers who've saved, because we haven't been subsidizing as much. Federal tax credit set to expire in a few years, so you're going to lose the opportunity to take advantage of those programs.
Thank you. I've got one more question for Wawa, and then I've got one more for the group, and I think we'll be out of time. So Wawa, if an organization wants to address cultural change, issues and partnerships and collaborations and engaging with young and old stakeholders, do you have any resources that you could share to help leaders who would like to do this in their organization?
Yes, a lot of the resources that I look to in regards to the things I talked about, since, for instance, I haven't entered the workforce yet, has been the Green 2.0 report, which we've been producing annually since, I believe, 2014. So, for instance, that report allows for organizations to self-report on things of gender and diversity in their organizations, and as a response, the organization does provide recommendations for folks on how they can work to better diversify their workforce and maintain an culture within their organizations or organizing spaces that is inclusive. I can try to compile a list of the other resources that I looked at as well and make that available, maybe in an email, or how folks are going to be getting access to this afterwards, but if that is helpful, I can send some of those resources over. There are diversity consulting groups that are out there. I can list them there as well.
Thanks, Wawa. So just for people who have been submitting questions, they're all really great questions, and I know we're running short on time. I'm going to compile those for our panelists so that we can respond in an email at a later date to answer some of these questions for everyone. The last question I have is for everyone here, and I think it's a great way to close things off today. What is one thing that you recommend that we as individuals or members of local communities can do to make a substantial impact in addressing the climate crisis?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time, Pat?
Just repeat that. Yeah.
Not a problem. What is the one thing you recommend that we as individuals or members of local communities can do to make a substantial impact in addressing the climate crisis?
I want to go first, Leticia. I think that the most important thing that people in the communities can do to help solve the climate crisis is to, one, educate yourselves by reading and researching some of the incredible reports that are out there by the IPC and local reports on what is causing climate change. Two, taking the information you learn and communicating it to every person you know in your life, but specifically contacting your local leadership and asking them to take action on the things that matter to you most. And three, asking leaders in your school system, in your community, and your legislated voted leaders to require climate change and energy education in all public schools for children K through 12, because that will get the message home to families and parents.
This is Mackey. I'm going to cheat and offer two. One, I think everyone should participate in both ground up solutions and top down. On the ground up side, it's exactly what Leticia said. It's educating yourself and then making sure that both your home and then the institutions that you're a part of are doing their part to reduce their energy use and go renewable. So make your home efficient. Be a voice at your church and at your business for making those buildings efficient. Your schools and your town and municipal buildings. We work with municipalities across the country or across the state to help them go solar, and as the Clean Energy Task Force, which is made up of citizens from the town, as they pressure to their town to make sure that they're being efficient and going solar, we see those projects happen, and as they happen across the state, it adds up. And then on the top-down side, and again, to agree with Leticia, it starts with education, and then making sure that energy is a priority for all your elected representatives, as well as those in the executive branch. For instance, one great example is, one of actually the first executive order that the Governor Lamont put out was an environmental focused one, which among many things set a goal of having our electric grid zero emission by 2040. So, the pressure on our electeds can lead to actions like that, so that we're getting both the top down and the bottom up approaches that are necessary to meet our goals.
To kind of echo some of the thoughts that were just talked about, I think participating civically is really important. Voting is so important. Also, running for office is really important. If your elected officials aren't presenting policies that you feel like resonate with you or your community, I think running for office is a completely viable step. And I think people should consider and see themselves as potential leaders within that space. But also, I think education is really important. But what's interesting, at least from my point of view, I think we can't just stop at education, because a lot of people know that climate change is happening. As someone who is a part of my generation, I think I'm Gen Z, right? Climate change has been a conversation that I first heard about global warming when I was in first grade. And in my mind, it's been presented to me from a very young age. But I don't think that education is the only thing that helps create change. I think something that also needs to happen is that we need to think about our narrative that we have within the environmental climate space. I think often it's a bit stale and very jargon filled and really inaccessible. And what we can do as individuals is begin to engage with climate change more personally, emotionally, and I think that helps build that resilience, that personal resilience, and that community resilience that will be so important now and when things get even more real. So I think trying to relate to climate change in other ways besides just numbers and models, but more in the ways that it impacts our lives and the way that it impacts other people.
I just want to say one more thing onto what Wawa said, and it's so true that that emotional engagement is so critical. And in order for people to be emotionally engaged, they need to know that the problem exists and it needs to be personal for them. They need to connect the problem of climate change with impacts on people they love, on their way of life, on the way we live as humans. And although COVID is really scary, this is a problem that's happening right now. And we'll very likely find a solution for it, and then that problem won't exist. But climate change, if we don't take action now, there'll be no going back. And so it's very important to remember and understand the difference between a current problem that's happening and a long-term problem that really needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Leticia. This is Mike Willig, and I wanted to end with two slides before we conclude today's webinar. First, I want to reiterate my thanks to the panelists, Mackey, Wawa, and Leticia, as well as to everyone in attendance for their participation in today's webinar. And we apologize and we appreciate your tolerance because of the technical difficulties that we've encountered along the way. I also want to highlight another virtual event associated with the Solve Climate by 2030 initiative in Connecticut. A climate change cafe will be convened on the 22nd of April between 2 and 6:30 p.m. The cafe will include presentations by two speakers, Scott Wallace, a professor of journalism at UConn, and Eric Fine, a program manager at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. The Climate Change Cafe will also include presentations by UConn attendees of the UN Committee of Parties on Climate Change that was held in Spain this year. Registration for that event, the Climate Change Cafe, appears at the bottom of this slide, and we'll be sending that out to everyone who participated. Next slide, please. In conclusion, I hope that you found the webinar to be informative and inspiring. Although climate change is a global issue, there are many solutions that you can advance at the local or regional level, and our panelists today spoke about many of them. Many others have been advanced in the other 55 plus state or national webinars that have been going on concurrent with ours, and I encourage you to peruse them at your leisure. Recordings of our webinar, as well as those from the other states and sites, will be made available in the very near future on the Solve Climate by 2030 webpage hosted by Bard College. Finally, it's incumbent upon all of us to be the difference that helps to solve climate change issues by 2020 and to contribute to long-term sustainability of our state, the country, and the world. And I want to reiterate a couple of the sentiments that I heard from our panelists today. And that is one way to make that difference, to be that difference, is to consider sustainability issues, climate change issues, and energy efficiency issues as you review candidates for local, state, and federal elections. Thereafter, you should vote for those candidates whose values correspond to those that you yourself hold dear. So again, thank you for your participation in today's webinar, and your very presence here is indicative of your dedication to solving the climate change crisis that we find ourselves in, perhaps the most existential threat to the future of human society. Thank you very much for your participation. And with this, we will conclude today's webinar.